The best game of 2020 in chess history. Daniil Dubov versus Sergey Karjakin. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. Italian opening. Bishop c5. Dubov's choice is c3. Now, we all know what this move means. Karjakin continues the game with knight f6. So, while preparing to castle to kingside, he started the pressure on his opponent's e4 pawn. Guys, the main continuation, which is calmer and more preferred, is the d3. Karjakin's played it too much. In the game, Dubov's preference, which was more suited to his style of play and more aggressive, was d4. Now that he wants both his opponent's bishop and his e5 pawn, he doesn't leave Karjakin much choice. E takes d4. Once again, we are at an important parting of the ways. The main move here is c takes d4. In this way, we have created the ideal and perfect center that we want to achieve. If our opponent allows these pawns to advance, we can get a huge advantage at the opening. So, the theory suggests, of course, bishop b4. Why? In order to prevent the opponent from advancing further from the center, we need to buy time to make d5. And we're doing this by checking with bishop b4. Of course, there are still ways in which the e4 pawn is sacrificed according to the opponent's reaction. Let's get back in the game. Against e takes d4, Dubov is playing a rare continuation that we haven't seen much of, b4. He asked his opponent's bishop an important question. What are you going to play? Actually, there are two main options here, either the bishop e7 or the bishop e6, as Karjakin did. Actually, the bishop f6 looks much nicer, because while maintaining the pressure on the center of the opponent, it can apply a nice pressure to the opponent's kingside throughout the game. However, as we will see later in the game, the absence of the bishop in the e7 can cause significant problems. Let's see. Bishop b6 versus e5. Yes, Dubov's advancing while demanding Karjakin's knight. Guys, the grandmasters are well aware of this continuation. It is one of the first continuations they learned when they first started playing chess. Because there are usually no safe permanent squares for this king to go to. Almost every game includes d5 attacking against the bishop. However, there is an important detail in this continuation. The king's bishop is no longer in this cross, and Karjakin, knowing that Dubov has a very deep preparation for him, chose to play knight e4, which is very likely to be overlooked. But when you look at this game, you should wonder why the knight g4 was not made, because it would demand this e5 pawn. You can handle this position in two ways. First, c takes d4. So, we now have a very strong center and have supported the e5 pawn. In a moment, with h3, we can send this knight to the corner of the board it would never want. At the same time, against knight g4, in order to maintain the development at full speed without caring about e5 pawn, kingside castling can also be made. Because if the e5 pawn is taken, this will be countered with rook e1, and it will not be good, as the knight will be in a pen. So, against e5, Karjakin played knight e4. However, knight e4 has a problem. Despite being in a beautiful and powerful center square, The pawn is not supported by d5, so it will not be very permanent here either. And Daniil Dubov continued to play with bishop d5. He demanded the knight. First of all, you might ask, well, Dubov physically blocked the d5. But can't we still make the f5 move to keep his knight in the e4 square? Keep in mind that the king is still in the center, and this f5 advance would not be a good choice, as it weakens this cross too much. It would be really hard to make kingside castling now. Then, the f5 move is not good. Well, against bishop d5. When I first looked at this game, I thought of the Hoffman-Petrov game. In that game, Petrov made knight takes f2 sacrifice. But there are some differences here. I won't go into detail about this continuation, but it could be a good tactical exercise for you. It is also very important in terms of comparing similar positions and similar games. Here, against knight takes f2, remember that in the Hoffman-Petrov game, Hoffman's pawn was in square b2, not b4, and this can make a big difference. I mean, the knight takes f2 sacrifice wouldn't be so good here, but you can still calculate it. Back in the game, against bishop d5, Karjakin makes the first move that comes to mind, knight takes c4. He didn't have much of a choice. Now, knight takes c3, d takes c3, and here's the bishop g5. What did we just say? The absence of this bishop in e7 can lead to significant problems. Here's the first problem. You're going to want to make a move like f6, because your king is still in the center here. Again, it weakens the cross, and that's not something we want. The knight e7. Now, kingside castling. h6, bishop h4. Dubov tells his opponent that it's not easy to get out of this pin. If you want to get out of this pin, you have to make bigger compromises. So, with g5, you need to weaken the king side more. For now, Karjakin didn't go for that and continues to play with kingside castling. But with his h6 move, he retains the g5 option in case it is required. Now, rook e1. The rooks should be centralized. Guys, please don't forget this rook move that seems so calm and quiet. What this rook does in the future will be remembered. Now, Karjakin played queen e8. The first way that comes to mind to get out of the pin. But it has some problems. Queen in on the same vertical as rook. And still the coordination between the pieces does not look good. Now that Karjakin wants to take this very powerful and central bishop that presses his own king with the knight. Of course, we will not give up this Italian bishop. Bishop b3 and a5, while the game is being played from the king side. Why is Karjakin suddenly attempting to play from the queen side? In fact, it's very connected to the king side. We'll see in the game anyway. Looking at the time now, Daniil Dubov has not wasted his time since the beginning of the game. I mean, it's almost the same as when it started. But after a long 20-minute thought process, he finds a very powerful move, such as bishop f6. In fact, it's not a bishop sacrifice. It's a very powerful move that puts the opponent psychologically under pressure, where the bishop approaches the king. If you accept this bishop sacrifice, g takes f6, e takes f6, as if the king side is shattered. You can't protect the material you take, because the knight is in a pin. Well, against bishop f6. Of course, trying to gather pawns when your opponent wants to mate you won't lead to good results. Karjakin continues his idea. a4. He wants to separate this bishop from the cross and unpin the f7 pawn. Here, Dubov refuses to accept this pawn sacrifice. Why? Let's have a look. The game will show us anyway. He played bishop c4. Now, knight g6. He really wants to take the bishop since in the previous variant, the knight will no longer be in a pin. So, queen d3. What does queen d3 want? Look, the f7 pawn is still in pin because Dubov didn't move his bishop from this cross. We simply want queen takes g6 and mate. If the bishop takes a4 was made, it would have given Karjakin enough time to recover in defense. But not now. Queen d3. Well, since the demand is queen takes g6, there's not much that can be done. d5. By closing the cross of this bishop, of course, there's e takes d6 en passant, and there's a discovered attack to queen. Bishop e6. Cold-blooded. Finally, Karjakin was able to move the same colored bishop in exchange for this very powerful bishop of his opponent. And here is the perfect moment. It's really amazing. Queen takes g6. It's no joke, a perfect queen sacrifice. We demand mate, so this sacrifice must be accepted. F takes g6. Here, rook takes e6. Aaron Nimzowitz has a beautiful saying. Keeping a threat hidden is often more effective than its immediate implementation, he said. That's what we see here. He demands both the queen and discovered checks. Looks like queen c6 is saving the situation here, doesn't it? Because when the rook makes a discovered check, it won't demand the queen. And after discovered check, the queen can take the bishop. But rook e7, now he made a discovered check. Of course, after king h8 and bishop takes g7, he'd be checkmated in a few moves, and the king h7 will lose to the rook takes g7 move. So queen takes c4, rook takes g7, king h8, rook takes c7. We took both pawns. Of course, this bishop that checks should be taken. Rook takes f6. We take the queen. When our opponent takes the passing pawn, we take the c3 pawn. Daniil Dubov is one pawn ahead at the end of this variant, and the seventh horizontal is severely weakened as a result of these pawns. So, if anyone could win this game, it would be Dubov. Karjakin didn't choose this. Against rook takes e6, he played queen f7 to close this cross. But Dubov has no intention of taking the queen immediately. He continues the game with bishop takes c3. He only has a bishop and a knight against the queen he has given him at this point. But would you take a look at these? Especially the bishop pair and rook. His king is also safe for the time being. Against bishop takes c3, king h8, to unpin the queen in this cross. Rook e4, give the queen. Queen f5. Rook e7 again. A fine rook maneuver. He protected his bishop first, and now he demands g7. That's why rook g8. Bishop takes g8 won the exchange. Rook takes g8, and the last row got a little weaker because he took one rook. Because d takes c7, a very powerful passing pawn that has reached the seventh horizontal. Here, we immediately come up with two principles of weakness. Karjakin has to deal with the pressure on his king, while controlling the pawn on the queen's side. So, the pieces have to fall apart a lot. Against d takes c7, queen c2 give the bishop, bishop e5. It is in a very safe square and protects the pawn, but queen c2 also demanded f2. First bishop takes f2, king h1, and bishop b6. Karjakin took a pawn and immediately moved his bishop back to b6. Why? Because, if he has to, he might be willing to take this very powerful pawn that will promote with his bishop at some point. He may have to lose his bishop. Or, if the rook moves to d8, he may wish to promote from c8, and if his opponent takes d8, he may wish to promote once more. That bishop has control over those crucial squares. h3, a prophylactic move. He continues to play as if nothing has happened, as if it wasn't Dubov who had just sacrificed his queen, but someone else. A safe square was opened for the king, and when the rook in a1 left the first horizontal and joined the attack, he avoided any mate demands from the last row. King h7. Karjakin is slowly trying to get out of this pen, but it's still not safe. Now, rook e1. Beware, the a2 pawn cannot be taken because there is rook takes g7, and if it is taken with the rook, we promote to queen. So we understand that the queen actually depends on the defense of this pawn for c8. Karjakin played a3 here. If he gets a chance to take a2, he can create a countergame with his passing pawn moving too far. Dubov continues to play with king h2 with a prophylactic approach. Karjakin is actually in a zugzwang. When we look at it, the bishop and the queen have to keep an eye on this pawn. At the same time, this rook depends on the protection of the g7. We can only advance pawns on the king's side. Karjakin played g7, but that weakened the f5 square, and the knight is on his way there, because when it reaches f5, the game's over. After bishop takes d4 and bishop takes d4, taking this knight immediately would leave Dubov with a perfect and unrivaled central bishop. Also, the queen is on demand with the rook e5, rook c5 maneuver, and we want promotion. That wouldn't be good. Against knight d4, queen c4, give the knight. Of course not. Knight f5, queen takes b4, now rook c1. There is a desire to promote. Karjakin first made king g6, trying to get his king out of the area, surrounded by rival pieces, so as not to be checkmated. Rook takes g7. It's a very nice tactic. If it is taken by rook, he'll promote, so the king must take the knight. After rook takes g8, there's a promotion desire once again, and the bishop, who has had to keep an eye on this pawn for some time, must now make a sacrifice to the pawn. Bishop takes c7. Bishop takes c7. Yes, even though he finally got rid of the pressure and took this passing pawn, but at what cost? 2 rooks and a bishop in exchange for the queen. On top of that, Karjakin's king is weak and very exposed, and Dubov's king is very safe. Against bishop takes c7, queen b2, he demanded the rook. Now rook c5, king e4, rook d8. Karjakin left the game. Why? If the a2 pawn is taken, first rook e5. That was the idea of rook d8, to prevent the king from escaping. King f4, one move, and against that, rook d4. The game would have ended in a mate. Karjakin left the game because there wasn't a very good defense against this idea of mate. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel. And click on the bell icon to stay updated with my new videos. Hope to see you in the next videos. Take care.